Welcome everybody. I'm Steve Adler. I'm director of the Ethics and Journalism Initiative here at NYU, and I'm an adjunct professor. Thanks for coming to the event. We're going to get some outside noise clearly, but we'll work through it. I think most of you by now know what the Ethics and Journalism Initiative is. We provide public events, workshops for students, mentoring for students. We have a website where you can get a lot of resources, ethics guides, AI guidelines from different news organizations, and we provide one-on-one mentoring. So if you have an ethics issue that you can't deal with in class or is happening in your freelancing work, I do one-on-one mentoring, and my colleague Karen Pensero does, who used to be Ethics and Standards editor of the Wall Street Journal. So please take advantage of that. My colleague Ryan Housel is here. You should meet Ryan. Ryan is both managing editor of the website, and she is the administrator of the new Collier Award for Ethics in Journalism. And you should be aware of that. Go to the website, ethicsandjournalism.org. There's a student category and a $5,000 prize for a first prize. And there's also a national and a local category with $10,000 and $15,000 awards. So we administer all of that. And as well as I also teach ethics here. So that's pretty much my background, but you're not here to see me, you're here to see Dr. John LaPook. So here's John. John is chief medical correspondent for CBS News. He is also, and I'm gonna do a lot of alsos, he's also professor of gastroenterology at NYU Medical School. He is a leading internist and gastroenterologist in New York at NYU Langone. He's been doing journalism for nearly 20 years, so if you look at him, you'd probably say he probably started, it wasn't his first career. Kind of started in middle age, so I'm sure he'll tell us a little bit about how that happened. He is self-taught as a journalist, but nonetheless risen to the top of his profession. He's a 5-time Emmy Award winner and has won many other accolades as well. You may remember the coverage of the sexual abuse of US Olympic gymnasts. John did, I believe, 2 60 Minutes investigative reports on that, which were hugely influential, and won the Gracie Award from the Alliance for Women in Media and was a Peabody Award nominee. He's also founded and runs the Empathy Project, which does short films and other educational work, basically to encourage doctors to have better bedside manner, to show empathy as they deal with patients. So as you can see, he's pretty busy. Does other things too, which I won't even mention. Full disclosure, John and I are old and very dear friends. We've discussed journalism ethics since his very earliest days at CBS. And I've got to say that John combines doing really effective, important journalism with maintaining the highest ethical standards about as well as anybody in the business. So we're so delighted to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you.
Just to start off, so what John's going to do is he's basically going to go through some clips from his work, and then he's going to talk about the ethical issues that were raised in those particular situations. I may ask some questions. You should also feel free to ask questions after each clip, because each one raises somewhat separate issues, and you might find it useful to, kind of weigh in with your questions, right after the clip. You want to first just tell us how you got interested in journalism? Everybody here is thinking about careers. By the way, how many people are focusing on video journalism? Either are video journalists or interested in doing video journalism in the room? So some, yeah. Okay, all yours.
So total accident. I had been on television as sort of like a talking head, talking about one issue or another, maybe 2 or 3 times. I was on the Today Show because I was an editor of the Columbia Home Health Guide, which is like a book for students. I ended up meeting Katie Couric. We became friendly. And then in March of 2006, I get a phone call from her. She said, and she was just about to become the first sole female anchor for the CBS Evening News. She said, I have a business proposal for you. How would you like to be the medical correspondent for CBS Evening News? I said, do you have to know anything? She said, no. I said, great, I can do that. But actually, it turns out you did need to know something. I think there was a little bit of miscommunication where they thought that I actually had been doing this as the medical correspondent for NBC, and I had been doing scripts and I didn't reading teleprompter, except that
So,
was
so when they saw you on the Today Show, they thought you were like a correspondent.
right.
Yeah,
or
right.
you
Yeah.
know, no, I
Yeah,
think it was more
yeah.
that Katie said, I
Yeah.
have this person who I
Yeah.
think would be good for
Yeah, yeah,
chatting, and
yeah.
somehow, because I don't know if you figured this out yet, but sometimes communication isn't perfect in the world. But anyway, that's always, I mean, nobody ever said that to me, but they found out pretty quickly because Bob Schieffer was there before Katie Couric. It was like in August of 2006, and a new drug called Chantix came out. And thank God we did a pre-tape, and Mike Somson's the producer. He says, just read the teleprompter and then turn to Bob and you'll have a little chat. Today, a new drug was okay, but all right, stop. John, have you ever read the teleprompter before? I said, nope. He said, all right, well, forget about that. And then I chatted with Bob, and they sent me to this Henry Higgins type person, Priscilla Shanks, who who is Peter Jennings, helped him, and many other people. And I think people usually were with her for like 3 or 4 months. I was with her for 2 years. Okay, and she was like a Yoda. It wasn't like the rain in Spain falls mainly on the plain. It was more like looking at the pieces and telling me, no, don't hit the word "and," because half of the people aren't even watching the TV. They're cooking dinner. You have to hit the right word and end the sentence this way. And anyway, so she, gradually fade out, fade in. It's now 18 years later, and they haven't fired me yet, but there's always time.
Well, you've done pretty well. So
I have to say though, because again, in full disclosure, Steve has been a real mentor to me throughout this whole process, especially with the ethics, and I've come to him on several occasions with ethical issues. And so I have to thank you publicly for that. I mean, that was really.
I hope I haven't led you astray.
Not once, not once, as far as I know.
Let's get started on the first clip because it's really interesting. I don't know if it needs a lot of teeing up in advance. Do you want to say anything about it? It's the mental health and gun violence before we show it, or you want to just show it?
I think we can just show it, and then what's not teed up, I'll tee up after the fact.
Okay, hit it.
Possible active shooter at the top.
After every mass shooting,
There's still shots being fired.
we hear a common refrain.
People with mental illness are getting guns.
Our inability to deal with mental illness.
Mental illness and hatred pulls the trigger.
People with mental illness are no more likely to commit acts of violence than people in the general population.
We spoke with the heads of both the American and Canadian Psychiatric Associations, Dr. Rebecca Brendel and Dr. Doug Ernest. Compared to other places in the world, does the United States have a significantly increased rate of mental illness?
The rates of mental illness in the United States are really quite similar to the rates of mental illness in Canada and in other countries around the world.
Despite those similar rates of mental illness, rates of firearm violence in the United States and Canada are very different. In 2020, there were 277 firearm-related homicides in Canada and more than 19,000 in the United States. Accounting for differences in population, the rate in the U.S. was more than 8 times higher.
So that's a really big difference that it cannot be attributable just to differences in the rate of mental illness.
What is causing somebody then to commit such a horrendous act as a mass shooting if it's not mental illness?
Saying that there's no mental illness does not mean that there's no psychological distress or there are no factors in an individual's life that might lead somebody to commit an act of violence.
There are a variety of factors relating to the risk of violence.
Doctors Brendel and Ernest say blaming mental illness for mass shootings diverts attention from the actual risk factors.
Social connectedness, substance use disorders, including acute intoxication.
Anger or resentment for having been mistreated or not fitting in.
People with a history of antisocial or violent behavior, of course. People who may find themselves in a situation that they perceive threat.
We do know that the best predictor of future act of violence is a past act of violence, but there's no one profile of an individual who commits an act of violence.
Both Dr. Brendel and Dr. Ernest say when people are in psychological distress, a key factor is having access to the means to commit violence.
During times of vulnerability, when people are on the edge of maybe or maybe not doing an act, access to lethal means is really a fateful factor.
In Canada, the estimated number of firearms for every 100 residents is 35. In the United States, it's 120.
We have more firearms than people in the United States. And so that difference really highlights the number one risk factor for gun violence, which is the presence of a firearm.
So
So my obvious question is that's a really great and important clip, but what does it have to do with ethics?
well, go back a little bit. I think it was in 2019 when there was another one of these mass shootings, and one of the medical societies made a statement about it, and the NRA tweeted out, "Doctors, stay in your lane." So this is our lane, public health, and I think that's part of the problem. Back in 1996, there was the CDC was pretty much had their hands tied behind their backs in terms of studying this as a mental health, as a public health problem by the Dickey Amendment, which basically said you can't, it took away funding from the CDC for anything that had to do with gun control. Many, many years went by, lots of time lost where you could study a complicated issue. 2018, I think they amended it so you could study gun violence, but still not advocate gun control. And I think the ethical issue here is, do we even have a voice in this? And then also, how do you approach a problem where it's very natural, especially in politics, to say, here's the answer, it's mental health. Okay, done. What's the next problem? This is complicated, and there are lots of different factors. And I think this business of saying, well, it's mental health, and then you say, well, in real life, let's compare us to Canada, and you say, no, actually, same amount of mental health, much more gun violence here.
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing that struck me and we talk about a lot in class is context. So you can look at the numbers in the US, but unless you compare them to someplace else, you're not actually putting the data in context. And so what you're saying to people who say, look at all the mental health issues we've got in this country and look at all the gun violence, you say, well, let's pause, right, and look at it in a neighboring country and see what the variables are.
Yeah,
Right.
and I think it's, one of the questions we always have is when you're reporting today's story, you have your nose forward, and you're just, what are the facts? But if you can have the time to pull back and get a little bit of a broader view of that, and that often takes more time. I have to say, in 2000, and I think it was about 5 years ago, September of 2019, after the "Stay in Your Lane" statement. CBS Sunday Morning gave me about 9 minutes, almost 10 minutes to do a story about this, which is almost unheard of. So, that's one of the nice things about being at a place where there's different formats and you can have some longer pieces there, or 60 minutes or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, another ethics issue there is you were debunking falsehoods, right? Mm-hmm. And that sounds like an obvious thing to do when you're a journalist. On the other hand, there are people who are very attached to the falsehoods. So did you get a lot of criticism for that piece from people who said, just like fact checking is often viewed as, from a purely political perspective now, was the gun lobby upset with you?
Yeah. There was plenty of people on social media who didn't like what we had to say. But I think that's why, I have to say that when I'm writing a story like this or covering it, I do think, am I being fair? Am I putting my finger on the scales?
Yeah.
And that's why it was so important for us I was so excited to get the head of the APA, American Psychiatric Association, the same person in Canada, have them talking to each other, get the stats, and then what are you going to say? We have the stats, and then we were able to back it up with the numbers, and you can't. The answer is you cannot just blame mental health. And I love that subtle point, which was sort of turned a little screw in my head of but wait, people are upset. Yeah, they're in distress. But there's no increase statistically in mental health in the people who are doing the shooters. But when you're in mental distress for lots of complicated reasons, if you have a gun, easier access to a gun, it's more likely you're going to use it. If you can, and we know it can be an impulsive thing, and you can get over that. And I have to just say, only about 1%, or maybe less than 1% of the deaths, and I think it's close to 50,000, are from mass shootings.
Yeah.
The most is around like 60% or so is from suicide, the rest is from homicide.
Yeah.
So just getting that in context too, you can save people from taking their own life because you can get them past that moment, that impulsive moment. That's huge.
Yeah. Other questions from the audience or comments on this particular issue? Are we ready with the microphones? And if you don't mind, can questioners identify yourselves and say where you're from? If you do mind, I guess you don't have to. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Molly Starkdean. I represent Women Do News, which is an organization that writes Wikipedia articles for women in journalism. I'm a very nuts and bolts person, so I'm going to ask a weird operations question. You talked about not being a journalist and learning kind of on the fly. How did you, this is your house.
Right.
And you're talking to a computer. Did you have to have a whole other learning process? And this is great for the students who will sit at home with their computers thinking, I can't be an anchor, but you're just news producing on the fly. How did that happen and who set you up?
Yeah, there was a thing called the pandemic. We're actually still at hopefully the tail end of it. We all started doing broadcasts from our homes. I did it from South Shaftesbury, Vermont. I did it from, this is my wife Kate's office. And it was always a little funny because I set it up myself. I'm kind of a techie person. I started a computer software company years ago, so I'm kind of technical. And I had a tripod, and I had a Sony camera, and I had lights, and I had, lavs, and of course, I would do this, and then I'd have to get it down to a computer, and then I'd have to upload it to Sony CI and all that stuff. But it always was amusing where after I had done a piece, which I thought was like really good, and I always go right to social media. Why? Because sometimes they catch mistakes that I've made, and the sooner I can catch them, the better. That's happened a few times. And then I would do a piece, and they would say, I loved the quilting that was behind you. I'm a member of a quilting club. And but what about it was a cure for cancer? No, but the quilting was amazing.
Funny. Other questions just on this clip? Yeah, go ahead.
Good day, everyone. My name is Prince from South Africa. I strictly came for this session. I come all the way from South Africa. My flight, I landed in the morning around 7.
Wow.
So, yes, I registered online because I wanted to come and see you, sir. Yes.
Wait, you flew here from South Africa for this lecture? Exactly.
Firstly, I work for the SABC, South African Broadcasting Corporation. I work as a producer on radio. And what you were speaking about, how you balance your stories, you had all the relevant guests there in order to balance your story, and how you were narrating it. It has shown how you've became the person that you are today when it comes to broadcasting. As you were saying, if you're a young journalist like us who still want to go a long way in the industry, you need to have someone who's, whom you're going to look up to, or whenever you need certain information, like, hey, there's something that I want to do. Am I doing it the right way? So I just want to say congratulations, sir. We look up to you as young broadcasters in South Africa. I do watch your shows. I do watch even online, even the CBS mornings. I do watch your work, and I know what it takes to be a young journalist. And looking now, I'm here now, and you are narrating and you're telling your story. I'm so inspired, sir. Thank you so much.
Well, that's an amazing thing to hear. And Ubuntu, right? It's I'm human because you're human.
Yes. That's an African proverb saying Ubuntu means humanity. Right. So thank you so much, sir.
Thank you for
even also for you guys to giving us an opportunity, because when I sent a request online, you guys responded because we said those who want to be part of this, and you gave us an opportunity.
So glad you're here.
Thank you so much. Amazing. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Okay. One last question on this one from me, and somebody else, India. Go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, I'm India Rice. I'm in the Reporting the Nation program from Atlanta, Georgia. And my question is, so when you're reporting on in-depth stories like this, where do you start when you want to get information from a various groups of people. So like, for instance, you have two people who specialize in psychology, right? So where in your process are you like, I need to get this person here, and how do you mesh the ideas together to create a cohesive story?
It gets easier. It's gotten easier over time because now I've been there 18 years and I know so many different people. So you don't have to be smart. You just have to know somebody smart. It starts with brainstorming with my producers. What do we want to do? We don't want to go too wide. We don't want a general thing. This was a perfect example because this was actually my idea, I have to say, that I've always wanted to do this. I remember hearing about, I guess, 2 towns right on the Canadian border, totally different statistics.
Yeah.
You know, it's like across the river.
Wow.
It's like, it was always in my head. And so I was able to pick up the phone. We have a relationship in CBS because we've done a ton of stories with the American Psychiatric Association. They said, oh my gosh, we'll connect you. And by the way, we know the person in Canada, so I didn't have to figure that out. They connected me and then we had a conversation. And I have to say, you know, for every 3-minute piece, there are hours of conversations that often go behind the scenes. And I have notes. Here's a tip, you know, and it's the same thing, how medicine set me up for journalism, because in medicine, if I didn't write it down, it didn't happen. So like if I call somebody today, you know, 9/24/24, phone to patient, 9:30 a.m., and I'm writing down everything, including lots in quotes. I did the same thing in journalism, and I save those notes, and I can go back and I can see what did I say, because you know sometimes you may recompile it when you go back a couple of days later. You go, oh, I missed that. That's what they said.
Does it usually start with an idea where you say this is a good idea, or does it start with a tip? I mean, I know it can happen different ways, but what's been your experience?
Yeah. So this was, you know, yet again, the news. How many times have we had these shootings, and then watching the TV and watching the same simplistic answer to a very complicated question. So that made me think, no, I'm gonna actually do something. It can be a tip. We're gonna see in a piece about a cancer drug shortage that was absolutely because Dr. Felice Zuas, who I was in medical school with, gave me a call and said that her friend who was getting chemotherapy for ovarian cancer suddenly couldn't get the medicine. There was a shortage. And I was like, what?
Yeah.
And so sometimes it's that.
Yeah. There's nothing wrong with tapping your personal contacts or experience. You may not use that person as your example in the story, but you get the idea. Somebody tells you they're having this particular problem. You go, wow, that's really interesting. And then perhaps you go pursue it and you report it. I think we should get to the next clip, which is on vaccine hesitancy. We're starting sort of in the middle, but I think it's fairly clear. I don't think it needs setting up either. So basically, there's a lot of vaccine hesitancy. John's doing a report.
The world.
The 1950s might be considered the high watermark of vaccine acceptance. Vaccines were then developed for diseases including measles, mumps, and rubella. As Americans, especially children, got their shots, rates for those diseases plummeted. But it all ran straight into the counterculture decade of the 1960s.
As more and more doctors and public health officials were encouraging people to get vaccinated or encouraging their children to get vaccinated, people were saying, but hold on, I need to ask questions. What are these vaccines for? Who made them? What's in them? And why are they necessary? Can you tell me that?
The overwhelming medical consensus is that the benefits of vaccines have far outweighed the risks.
And we're talking about our kids.
But an upsurge in the anti-vaccine movement was fueled by a 1998 study in a prestigious British journal that falsely linked the measles vaccine with autism. It took 12 years for the journal to retract the study after concluding the research was fraudulent.
If you asked me 40 years ago, would I ever have to be defending vaccines like I do now, I'd say you're crazy.
So what happens in here?
This is the first step in our vaccine production process. We use fermentation technology. It's actually similar to the technology used in making beer.
Dr. Peter Hotez has worked for decades to develop vaccines at the Baylor College of Medicine and Texas Children's Hospital.
Everybody knows the life-saving impact of vaccinations.
One study estimated that by the end of 2022, the COVID vaccine had saved more than 3 million American lives.
I'm worried there's a full-on frontal assault on biomedical science and
He's
possibly
entered the public
attempt to bring
debate
down
as a
the
passionate advocate for vaccines and become a bit of a lightning rod.
Unfortunately for all of us, when Peter Hotez speaks, he discredits American medicine. He is a misinformation machine.
When we talk about anti-vaccine, anti-science movements, we call it misinformation or infodemic, as though it's just some random junk out there on the internet, and it's not. I want to convince you today that it's organized, it's deliberate, it's politically motivated, and it's having a devastating impact. It's reached that level of 200,000 Americans needlessly dying because they refused to take a COVID vaccine.
With public figures like former presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. vocalizing vaccine skepticism, Dr. Hotez believes politics has turbocharged historical reasons for resisting vaccines. He sees a widespread issue.
Why would somebody want somebody else not to get vaccinated?
It's a form of political control, and it's a part of creating another issue to galvanize their base.
As an historian who knows about the arc of the vaccine movement in a way that most of us don't know, are you concerned about where vaccines are right now in terms of the public?
What I will say is that I'm not at all surprised. We've been here in some respects before. Vaccination resistance bubbles up when we use more vaccines and when we use more of the force of law to encourage or require vaccination. When I hear arguments and when I hear frustration that people aren't getting vaccinated, how can they not understand? My response is, let's try to understand their distrust. Let's try to understand their concerns, and let's take them seriously.
But as we try to benefit from the...
Great.
Yeah.
Fascinating. I mean, many things struck me. One was, typically in a story like this, I would think you'd be debunking vaccine resistance. You'd be saying it's kind of crazy people who believe it. But there was a lot of empathy, to use the word that you use a lot, in the story, saying we need to understand them. Have you always done that in your reporting? Why did you do that, and why is that important?
Yeah, I've tried to have that tack to sort of, again, pull back the microscope, look at the big picture, and just, rather than saying, well, people are insane, they're just insane, forget about it. And, I remember this Aesop's fable. I used to love Aesop's fable. And one of my favorite ones was the wind and the sun having a contest to who can make the guy take the coat off.
Oh, yeah.
So the wind blows, and of course, the more you blow, the more it tights, and then the sun comes out and the coat's off in 2 seconds. And the moral of the story is persuasion's better than force. So I have to check myself and say, well, it's not my job to convince somebody, take a stand and convince somebody. It's to take a deep breath in, take a deep breath out, investigate it, look, and that's what looking at the history of this did. It gives you great perspective, and then present it in a logical way. We did another one, again, I think that one was for CBS Mornings, for Sunday Morning, years ago, where, it turned out we went to the Pacific Northwest where people were sort of green and they didn't want to do it because, like, don't tell me what to put in my, and then we went also to Texas and they did it on the other side of the political spectrum for, don't tell me what to do. Right. So everybody was saying, don't tell me what to do. Yeah. And it turns out there's been a lot of, if you watch the whole piece, there's been vaccine hesitancy since there are vaccines. Benjamin Franklin went to his grave regretting that he didn't give an early form of smallpox vaccine to his then 3-year-old son, Frankie Franklin, who then died of smallpox. So there's always been resistance, and just understanding that it's not just something unique to now, and then trying to say, okay, what's going through their heads? And I've spoken to people. In fact, one of the people who we interviewed was a woman who was certain that the MMR vaccine had given her son autism. Yeah. And she was so upset. And then it turned out there's been some tremendous research with genetics, and also showing that you can see the autistic changes before the first shot is given. So it's not the shot. It's been debunked through, the fact that there is no plausible link has been shown through many. In fact, it's been a waste of a lot of time. Yeah. And she then felt so relieved. And then at the end of the piece, she goes, "Oh my God! At first, I was so upset that I didn't want my son to that I had done this, and now I'm so upset because I can't wait to get him vaccinated, the next child vaccinated." So, I mean, that, I think it's a really good feeling to try to. Don't just say, "Listen to me." It's like as a kid, you hate. What's the worst thing that your parent would say when you ask why? Because I said so. So as a journalist,
my parents never said that. Okay.
Because I said so is not the answer, and it's just presenting some facts, and because I have the assets to go out and do some research and speak to experts, that helps.
And we're in such a polarized time that it's really interesting and useful to hear, a leading journalist say, we don't just say they're crazy, we don't just say they're wrong, we're trying to, figure out where they're coming from. It doesn't mean you have to agree with them. In fact, you can disagree with them staunchly. But I was just thinking, you're a parent, obviously I'm a parent. It's a real concern of a parent. What are you doing to your child? And if the Lancet does a story that says there's a link between this very, very common vaccine and autism, that's going to scare you, right? So, I mean, it both goes to what misinformation is out there, but it also goes, which I wanted to ask you about, even when you're debunking misinformation, lots of people still believe it. Does that, as a journalist, we talk about it a lot in class.
Does
that frustrate you?
It's exactly what I wanted to talk about, because when you mentioned this Lancet article, 1998, I came to CBS in 2006. So by the time I was there, it was sort of, people knew, the scientists knew that it was a lousy article from the very beginning, but it took 12 years for it to get retracted. And he lost his license, and although actually he came to America and he's now kind of set up doing business here. But I did cover it, but we did have the discussions. We don't want to sort of shine a light on this. We want to shine a disinfecting light, but on the other hand, people hear autism, MMR, and they're half listening and they think there's a link. And so it's, finally I did a bunch of pieces and I just said, well, listen, I'm just going to say what it is, and hopefully people are listening. So I don't think as a journalist, I think it was probably a mistake that journalists made after that in 1998 and on, to not make more of a deal of it, sort of let it sort of festered in darkness. And I think that, again, the disinfecting light, I think, is the way to go.
Yeah, it's so hard when you feel like you're repeating a falsehood. Saw that in the debate where the stories about immigrants eating cats and dogs. If you constantly focus on it and you swarm into the town, are you actually getting more people to believe it, or are you debunking it? And it's a challenge we always face. There are some studies that show fact-checking. When you fact-check something, people are more likely to believe it, not less likely, and we have to think about what's our responsibility anyway. And I think we probably agree. It's, you want to get the facts and the truth out there, and you're not entirely responsible for whether people believe it, but you want to do it as effectively as you can, so people are more likely to believe it.
I also have a sense of history with it, that sometime down the line, somebody's going to look back and did somebody take the time? I have a unique ability because I'm at CBS News. I can call anybody. They pick up the phone. It's amazing. It's been amazing for my medical practice because, I have, it's like the greatest continuing medical education ever. And so I have a unique ability to, at that moment, put together a set of facts, got amazing editors and researchers and graphics people, and put together a little piece. It's a little piece of history. Yeah. Somebody will go back, and it needs to be right.
Yeah, so you are setting the record for posterity, even if people aren't necessarily believing you right now.
Right.
Yeah. Questions or comments on this particular one? Yeah, Maya. Let's. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Maya Cox. I'm in the Reporting in the Nation program. So just going off of what you guys said, you have journalists like Oprah Winfrey who gave anti-vaxxers and a platform to kind of spread that misinformation, the doctors that went on her show to kind of push the propaganda about the autism subject. So would that be considered unethical that she gave them a platform to talk about these things, because it was kind of something that wasn't debunked yet?
Well, yeah, timing's everything. I mean, if it really, I don't remember when that was, but I mean, if it was up, it was debunked pretty quickly. And of course, there's the whole equivalency. You know, there are those people who believe the earth is round and those other people believe it's flat, and we're going to talk about both of them. And I think at least, you know, in journalism, I mean, in the news, I think we have the responsibility to weigh in on that and say, look, if it's absurd, we don't give oxygen to something that's absurd. I think on an entertainment show, you know, the standards are less, so I don't want to weigh in there. I don't know the timing of that and all that, but I do think hopefully that's the difference between news and entertainment. I know those lines get blurred very often and increasingly, but I mean, I take it really seriously, you know, that people are listening and they're like my patients, and I want to tell them exactly what I think. And I did have a very good criticism early on when I was on the air from somebody who did reviews of every broadcast, you know, and he called me and he said, I had said something at the end with Katie Couric and something like, well, you know, in my practice, da 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 da. And he said, who died and made you America's doctor? You know, if you're going to say something like in my practice, then I guess I didn't set it up well enough that, okay, we're now done reporting the news, and now I'm going to tell you my opinion.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important.
Well, you sort of play a dual role because, you know, you are a doctor on television as well as a news reporter. You do stories on CBS Sunday Morning where, you know, it crosses over a little bit. You ask questions about, well, you know, what should people do about this? I mean, how do you see that? Do you feel as if giving medical advice on TV is part of your job broadly, or public health advice, or not?
I try not to give medical advice. From me, John LaPook. And I think that was something that I learned early on. And I don't remember exactly what the wording was if I said it back then, but I left him at least thinking, So I think I generally will say, well, the CDC says this, Tony Fauci says this, you know, Francis Collins says that. But without saying, because I think it's right to say, well, like, what, we're supposed to listen to you, you know, in your humble opinion. I mean, I will say, because who knows if we have opportunity to say it some other time, that, you know, as you're dealing with these very controversial themes, you know, we've already done vaccines, talking about gun, that we live in a time that is, I mean, this is obvious, it's so dangerous for, you know, people. We're being called the enemy of the people. I mean, I interviewed Tony Fauci many times, including, you know, he was followed by security people. He was threatened. Somebody was caught going across the country with a AR-15 to kill him. You know, we live in different times. Anyway, I think that's just another factor, you know, in the ethics of all this.
Yeah. What question from somebody who hasn't? I'm sorry, Molly, hasn't asked one yet. Go ahead.
Hi, my name's Annie. I'm in the audio reporting program here. I was wondering, when you're reporting on complex science or policy, how do you decide what and how much background context to provide for the average viewer?
Great question. At the end of it, it's that if I'm talking to one of my patients, will they understand me? Now, I do a very deep dive on every piece to understand all the science myself. And the image in my head is like, when I come out of the water, there's a few drops that are still on me, and that's what I give to the audience, you know, the stuff that's been, you know, they don't have to know about the uncus of the parahippocampal gyrus. They just need to know there's a place in the brain where the thing happens, you know, or whatever the simplest way of saying that is. I mean, 60 Minutes is a great example of that. We did a bunch of stories during the pandemic. One of them was on variants, all these different variants. We were the first people, like months before Delta, before the first variant, we knew there was going to be variants. I spoke to Paul Dupre, who was an expert from University of Pittsburgh, and oh my gosh, that was so technical. And then it was beautiful to see the graphics people and Paul Dupre and our producers sort of simplify it and simplify it and simplify it. It's like in cooking, whatever you're boiling it up, and finally you get this thing that's left, this purified glop of journalism at the end. And if you go back and look actually at our piece on variants, you'll see, I mean, we're talking about the spike protein, we're talking about evolution, but it's so satisfying to put something out there like that and then have people say, oh, that was complicated, but I really understand it. And I think it's important to not duck the tough things to explain, because that's where real understanding from the public goes.
And I mean, a great trick is to speak in plain language to the average person without condescending or talking down, and it's a very big challenge, which, you know, you address all the time. And
You have to, and that's why it's easier, like when you're on the, if I'm on CBS mornings, it's a much more natural flow. When I'm on the evening news, you know, you may have a minute 40 and then a live tag, or maybe a very quick back and forth, and it tends to be stiffer. So people say that the mornings are, you know, they're seeing more me. But then on the other hand, it's live and you got to watch what you say.
So keeping track of time, I'm not going to take more questions on this one now, but if we have time at the end, we can come back. But I want to go to the next one.
Dr. Hotez was also threatened his life, who was just on.
So let's go to the next one, which see while you're watching it if you can see what you think the ethics issue might be, and then we can talk about what it turned out to be.
Drugs are running out. The reasons include manufacturing problems,
chemotherapy
and reduced
drugs.
production due to lower profits with generic drugs. FDA Commissioner Dr. Margaret Hamburg.
The industry has to not be afraid to let the FDA know if they have a problem, so that we can get in there and work with them to fix it before it results in a shortage.
The FDA says the two bills that have been languishing in Congress would help fix the problem.
You're saying pass it.
We met with sponsors of the legislation, Republican Senator Susan Collins, Democratic Senator Amy Klobuchar, and Representatives Diana DeGette, a Democrat, and Tom Rooney, a Republican.
Can you explain this to Americans? You have something that's truly life-saving. You have both parties agreeing on it, and yet it cannot get brought to a vote.
I don't know what has to happen for people to recognize that this has to happen.
Why would we turn our backs on these patients and on the medical community who needs this help when we know something works?
Why does it take months and months? Why not today?
I've been in Congress 16 years. I have never seen a Congress where it was more difficult to pass legislation. I think you should call the leadership and ask them why they haven't brought this bill up for a vote.
So we did. We showed up at Speaker of the House John Boehner's weekly press briefing.
Why is it that legislation that everybody agrees is desperately needed is taking so long to pass?
The Congress is working on this. The Senate is getting ready to move a bill. The Energy and Commerce Committee is getting ready to mark up a bill in early May. But I would also ask, where's the administration been? Where's the President of the United States been?
When we spoke to the legislators, they said to talk to you about the leadership.
I respect the committee process. And the committees have their work to do to investigate this.
Remember, that committee process began over a year ago. During that year, another of Elena's drugs has hit the shortage list, leucovorin. She needs it to soften chemo's toxic effects.
The leucovorin doses, I can't imagine what it would be like without it. When you have diaper rash that's literally an open wound over your whole bum, it's like screaming in pain. It's horrible.
Legislation has now cleared a committee, but still needs a vote by the full Senate. Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid.
Explain to me why it takes 14 months since that first bill was introduced before anything is even beginning to look like it's going to happen.
Well, you know, as I said, things take a long time. That's when someone's been a governor in the state, they come to Congress and go, wow, what's going on here? But that's the way we've always been.
As one of the leaders, can you go and talk to somebody and say, come on, move it along? I mean,
Doctor,
what can you do?
I would say this. First of all, things have happened. We'll have it on the floor soon. It's a step in the right direction. But there's no way that I or anyone else can explain how slowly things move here in the Senate. It's been that way for 230 years.
Fortunately, Elena has not yet missed any medicine, but others have. This legislation, while not the entire solution, is at least a step in the right direction.
Okay, it's sort of a trick question, an amazing report. By the way, that's 2012, so that's very early, and it's also much earlier in John's career, which he'll tell us about in a minute. Anybody want to just chat out what you think the ethical issue was? Go ahead, Julia.
That's a good one, yeah. That always is an ethical, and who has the power to give consent? In this case, they wanted to tell their story because they wanted something to happen for them. And that's an ethical thing too. Are you taking advantage of the fact that somebody is desperate? But in this case, I think it was the right thing to do.
Yeah, it's a trick question because the big ethical issue happened off camera.
Yeah.
And that's so often the case. The thing you're dealing with is not necessarily what was published or what was aired. So why don't you tell us about it?
So this was the very first story I had done that was really a political story. I'd certainly never done a story in Washington. This could not have been farther from my comfort zone. I pitched it as Dr. LaPook Goes to Washington, if you like the Frank Capra movies. It was turned down about 3 or 4 times. I found that after the fact, they said, oh, let him do it. If it stinks, we won't put it on the air.
But people thought it was naive to think you could go in.
Yeah,
and-
you're just going to go down to Washington and you're going to talk to these people and something's going to happen. Or they just thought, I'm not a political reporter, which could not have been more correct. So we did all that, and what happened was when Senator Harry Reid ends with, nobody can figure out why things take so long. It's been that way for 230 years. The second he said that, that was sort of the end of the interview, and the person who was assistant flipped out. He knew that was just not a great quote from his, sort of like, well, what can you do? It was a little not, it wasn't the quote that he wanted from the senator, and he went really kind of like ballistic. He ended up calling my producer and saying, Dr. LaPook, words to the effect of, Dr. LaPook has seriously compromised the relationship between the senator's office and CBS News. And now this is an exact quote, and this will be reflected across all platforms.
And they were trying to get you not to air it.
Yeah, or to bully me into, maybe not using that quote, or to
not to air that quote.
Not to air that quote. Yeah. But they didn't specifically say that. It was just sort of going sort of ballistic. And so I ended up calling Chris Isham. And by the way, for the ethics of this, I called Chris Isham this morning and said, may I use your name in telling the story? And he said, yes. He was laughing. I called him, and, I was shaken up because did I just screw up the relationship? So I did the quote, and I said, you've seriously affected the relationship, compromised the relationship between the senator's office and CBS News, and this will be reflected across all platforms. And there's like a 3-second pause. And Chris goes, what relationship?
And what did that mean to you?
Oh my God, it meant that he had my back. It meant that, and when I told him the story this morning, he said, yeah, that's the typical blustery, response. They want to burn, they go nuclear, they want to burn the house down, and it's to intimidate you. And I think I was a little bit intimidated by that, was my first story, and then him backing me up on that really helped. I mean, and you've got to have a news organization. You're out there on a tightrope. If they're not backing you up, you're in trouble.
Yeah, and we talk about this a lot, but don't let politicians take back quotes. I mean, if you're interviewing somebody who's never talked to a journalist on the street, and you can be more empathetic, but you don't let a politician take back a quote. I mean, they're public figures. He has to be responsible for what he says.
And there's actually a sort of a side story that this reminded me about in terms of the organization having your back, which was right at the very beginning. Katie Couric was still the anchor. And I went on, it was a story about vaccines and how often, at the end of it on the teleprompter, I read how often you give vaccines to kids. And for the first vaccines for infants, you give it twice in the year, and then after that, once a year. And somehow on the prompter, and I knew it as I was reading it, but it was live, I implied that the kids had to have it twice a year, every year. So I was very upset afterwards, and I asked the producer of the piece, I said, I want to correct that tomorrow night, and she said, well, we'll put it up on the web. And I said, no, you're not going to say it before millions and correct it before thousands. And I worked myself into this tizzy, and I remember calling Kate the next day and saying, would you be okay with me quitting? Because if they don't back me up on this, I'm quitting.
Yeah.
And it reminded me of the Marx Brothers scene. Remember that, where he's standing there. There's been a war forever between these two.
Duck soup?
Yeah, and he
Yeah.
goes, he's standing, he's waiting for the king to come in. He goes, it's going to be great. I can't believe we're going to finally have peace after all these years. But wait a second, what if I put my hand out and he doesn't take it? Well, that's a fine, how do you do? Here I shake out my hand. He gets himself into this tizzy, and the guy comes in, he goes, comrade, he goes, you won't take my hand? It's war, So that's where I was. And I walk into the fishbowl, and I say to Rick Kaplan, who was then the executive producer, I tell him the story. I said, I want to do a retraction on tonight's news. And he said, what's the worst that can happen? I said, the worst that could happen is that a mother hears that she has to give her baby vaccine twice a year instead of once, and decides not to give it, and the baby gets the flu and dies. He goes, Chris Steinen, we're doing a retraction tonight. And Katie Couric did a retraction of that. It's the one and only time we did a correction. I got more positive feedback from that.
Yeah. People really love it when you correct mistakes.
Because if you're not correcting it, you must be right, or you must think you're right.
Yeah. And also correcting trying to reach the same audience you reached in the first place is something that many journalism organizations do wrong. And the notion that you would post something on a website when you made the mistake on the air in front of millions of people, but that's very common. So even if you're doing digital reporting and you get something wrong, you want to think of all the platforms it went out on and see if you can get your correction out on all of those platforms, so that you're reaching as many people as you reached with the mistake in the first place.
And that's why I look at social media immediately, because they go, wait, you said the wrong name of the hospital or something like that. Boom, because in about 30 minutes, it's everywhere,
I know a lot of students need to get back to class in a while, so I do want to get to the last one because it's really moving and important. This is a 2010 clip from Haiti.
100 miles northwest of Port-au-Prince, the city of Port-de-Paix, population 250,000, has no paved roads and limited electricity. It's the poorest part of Haiti and a stark reminder of the state of healthcare even before the earthquake struck on January 12th. By 8 a.m., 400 patients line up at the Northwest Haiti Christian Mission. Its clinic doesn't have enough equipment, but is still one of the best in the area.
Are you already starting to see effects of the earthquake?
Absolutely.
What kind
We
of
saw
effects?
them immediately. We saw a huge population shift to this zone.
As many as 700,000 people left Port-au-Prince after the quake. 50,000 came to this area. Mary Saint-Fleur is one of them.
The house fell down on you.
Yeah, the house fell down. And that roof was being like this in my head.
A steel door crushed Mary's leg and broke her foot. Her leg is badly swollen, and she came to the clinic because she's afraid of losing it.
Where did the tears come from? Is it from the pain or the sadness or both?
I don't know.
Even a simple x-ray would help the doctors figure out why her thigh is so swollen.
You can't get a CT or...
But there's no x-ray machine here, and Mary can't afford the $15 it would cost at the public hospital in Port-de-Paix. The earthquake crippled the healthcare system already desperate for a government overhaul. But the disaster incapacitated the government too. 49 of the 80 public hospitals in Port-au-Prince were damaged. An estimated 10,000 non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, have stepped up to care for the 2 million Haitians living in tents.
This is the best formula for disaster. That's what I've said since the beginning.
Dr. Reginald Lubin is a Haitian doctor working for the NGO World Vision.
When you look behind you, there is not enough space, not enough sun coming into the tents. And people are living in promiscuity. And you have not only all the risk for epidemics.
Epidemics of diseases like typhoid and hepatitis. And without clean water or proper shelter, the best efforts of NGOs are not enough.
This used to be the Ministry of Health. Rebuilding it will be the easy part. The hard part, creating, for the very first time, an effective public health system.
To do that, there needs to be leadership and coordination under a central organization.
NGOs coming from all over the world, they do whatever they want.
Dr. Gideon Gellin is a former government health official. He says the outlook is not good.
In my mind, it is very clear that the health system could fail.
To keep the system from failing, there's a call to decentralize Port-au-Prince, move the resources into other provinces, and encourage NGOs to train Haitians to help themselves. As the nation struggles to survive, back at the clinic, the two babies do the same. The premature baby's mother seems resigned.
How did you feel to see the baby so small?
My heart was breaking because I see that my child is so weak.
What comes next for you and the baby?
Well, God gave me this child. If he takes it, it's his will.
The preemie is having trouble breathing. In the US, over 90% of such babies survive. But 5 days later, the baby boy died. As one mother grieves, the mother we saw in labor welcomes her healthy baby girl into the world. A 6-pound, 11-ounce symbol of Haitian resilience. Dr. John LaPook, CBS News, Port-de-Paix, Haiti.
Okay, taking a moment to absorb that, it's incredibly powerful. So you go down there, you're a doctor, you're also a journalist. People are clearly in distress. What do you, as a doctor and journalist, how do you look at your two roles, and does one end and the other start at some point?
Yeah, I mean, that's, I still like looking at my shoes so I don't like burst out. So that story, lit the health equity fire under me. And I met Paul Farmer, Dr. Paul Farmer, the great Dr. Paul Farmer. And since then, somebody asked me, like, what's been the theme since then? I've done over 1,200, 1,300 pieces. It's by far health equity issues, and this was so crushing to see. So what I told my producer was that when I'm down there, I'm a journalist. I'm also going to be a doctor helping people. When I flip into doctor mode, you turn off the camera. Plenty of doctors down there. I don't have to be, because there is an unavoidable conflict of interest. Look at me, I'm a doctor, look what I'm doing. That was my decision. I know other people made other decisions. That was the decision I made. And in fact, when that woman who hurt her leg, I was standing around it and they wanted me to examine the leg. I said, turn off the cameras. And then I examined the leg and made a recommendation. But
and was that because there wasn't a physician you felt was present at the time who could do it?
They wanted my opinion since I was, a doctor from New York, and I was also, they were shorthanded. I believe there was, can't remember who the other health professionals there were, but a lot of times it was nurses, PAs. There may or may not have been a doctor there, but I know they wanted my opinion. I said, turn off the camera.
I mean, it's a tough issue that in lots of reporting, even if you're not a doctor, when do you keep shooting and when do you stop and help? And there are famous hypotheticals and famous cases we talk about in class, but do you just have to kind of go with your gut as to what your personal responsibility is in that moment?
Yeah, I think so. And look, you and I have talked about even what is my responsibility in terms of getting permission from people, to film them. I got permission from her to film her. But if you're in St. Mark's during the cholera outbreak, I was there and there was a whole, many, many, many people there. And we had a wide shot. We got permission from whoever was running it, I think, but still is that individually going from person. So I think there are those issues, and I rationalize it as, we're making public awareness, we're getting them resources, and people didn't understand that it was a huge deal. But I always think about the privacy issues, and does this person, first of all, have we asked for consent? Do they have the ability to really give consent? Is there a power relationship where they don't want to, they're saying yes, but they don't really have the ability to say no? Because here I am, with my camera. So.
Tough questions. Let's open it up in general to the floor, either anything on this one or anything on anybody else, and we'll be available for another 15 minutes or so if if you've got the time to stay for that. So who's got questions or comments for John? It could be about anything. It could be about careers. It could be about these clips. It could be about the Haiti clip. Chris?
Sure.
Could we get a microphone? We need the mic for recording. Yeah.
Hi. Can I ask if was there a follow-up to this when you do a story like this and expose how devastating it is?
Oh, yeah.
Do you want to go back and do your producers want you to go back a year later, 2 years later?
And we did that. We have a beautiful piece. A couple of years later, we went back to Mibale, which is in just kind of central Haiti, because I was with Paul Farmer, and right on the spot where a mother years ago, I don't know if you haven't read Mountains Beyond Mountains, read it about, he's written 1 million books, and tragically he died a few years ago of a heart attack in Rwanda. But we were standing in the same place where he had lost a mother who had had malaria years ago, and now he built this, him and through partnership with the government and others, partners in health, they built this hospital and hadn't yet opened. I should have grabbed that, but you can find it. And we're walking through the maternity ward, and I said, what are you looking to give birth to here? And, he said, just once, it's the best statement of health equity I've ever heard in one sentence. It was, just once, I want to see somebody who was born in abject poverty get the same kind of care as somebody who was born in some ritzy part of New York, say. And that kind of equity and humanity is what we're looking to give birth to. Boom, done. And then we went back then after that, and in that same hospital, conjoined twins were separated. I was in the operating room, and that was the first time that was ever done in Haiti. And so yeah, that very same hospital has been amazing.
I will get to you, Molly, but let's go ahead.
Hi, I'm Susanna. I'm a reporter at First Amendment Watch downstairs, actually. But I'm curious, before discussing not giving a megaphone, let's say, to people who are either conspirizing about different public health effects, especially about like vaccine hesitancy, but where are your considerations or lines when, of course, maybe the entire medical profession or community might not always agree on the same thing, but there is a general consensus? I mean, when do you decide, this idea is important to include, even though it might not be the overarching idea that all the media is sharing at once?
Yeah, I think the answer is have humility, because it was like half of medical knowledge changes every, 7 years or some number of years. Aspirin's good for you, aspirin's bad for you, hormones are good for you, hormones are bad for you, take vitamin D, don't take vitamin D, take vitamin C, don't take vitamin C. So if you've been around long enough, I've been a doctor for 44 years now. I mean, if you've been a doctor for 5 years, forget about journalists, if you've been a doctor for 5 years and you still have hubris, you are in the wrong profession. So I think when you're presenting these changes, you do it with you provide the context. You don't say, today, this is the fact. And I think that, people, and Dr. Francis Collins very wonderfully sort of wrote about this recently, that one of the mistakes in communication during the pandemic was not communicating well enough that this is what we're advising today based on today's facts, with today's understandings, today's data, that may change tomorrow, and not using the kind of language that's saying this is how it is and implying this is how it's always going to be. So yeah, I think it's just context and humility and tone of voice. Here's a hopefully you'll know something before everybody. I have a piece about tone of voice that's going to be on Sunday morning. It's a straight to camera, and it's talking about tone of voice and about how you say something is so crucial. It starts from when the piece starts with me going into my son. My son Daniel's 32. I'm going into his room. He's in the crib. And I go, good morning. Hi, how are you? So you learn from the earliest time in your life that to trust a certain tone of voice, and the opposite is true. If it's harsh, if it's loud, it can be frightening. And I think that's something that's important. And for me as a journalist communicating, a lot of people have come up to me during the pandemic, and I never felt I said anything so brilliant. Seriously, I was just trying to communicate what other people, my understanding was, but they would say, you know, it was calming the way you said it. So it was my first piece for 60 Minutes about this. A Johns Hopkins professor said, you can understand how people, government figures want to reassure the public. He said, John, we are not departments of public reassurance. We're departments of public health. And we went back and forth a little with the idea being that even if the news is upsetting, if people know you're leveling with them, that's reassuring. And I think that's been a big lesson for the pandemic, and I think it's a broader lesson, I think, for me as a journalist in medicine.
Go ahead, Molly. Can we get the microphone up here?
Hi, my name is Molly Starkdean. I'm a Reporting the Nation alumni, which is why I'm so glad that lots of Nations people are asking questions. I was actually in the first class of Nations.
Oh, really?
And I also got my COVID vaccine yesterday. I still have the Band-Aids to remind myself to move my arm. How do we separate vaccines from government? Because the government killed my dad. My dad died of Agent Orange poisoning. So how am I supposed to convince my anti-vaxxer little sister that vaccines have nothing to do with government?
What a question. Okay.
Well, we always say, start off by listening. What exactly are your questions? And try one by one to address them, to address them seriously. Look them and attitude is everything here, right? It's like, don't roll your eyes. That was the Sunday morning piece that we did. Actually, there was a woman in the Northwest, Pacific Northwest, who she and a doctor pediatrician she worked with, they just took people seriously. People want to be seen and they want to be heard. It's the same, it's health equity, it's everything. People want to be seen and they want to be heard. So you see them and you hear them, and if they have some kind of concern that you don't know the answer to, don't just bulldoze over them. Say, you know what, let me research that a little bit and let me get back to you about that. But I think tone of voice, taking somebody seriously, and then also knowing your stuff. So if they start to say things like, well, I really, really, really think that vaccines cause autism, if you can show the data that really pretty much without a doubt says that it's genetics and the changes are happening before the first shot. I mean, that's very powerful, because it was always like, well, maybe they're right, and of course, always leaving that one in a whatever chance that there's maybe something else we don't know about, but on balance, that's why in that piece we said the overwhelming evidence is that the benefits outweigh the risks. So nothing in life is without risk, and certainly not in medicine. If something's pharmacologically active and it can help, it's pharmacologically active and can hurt. So people have had reactions to vaccines. Don't say there's never a reaction to a vaccine. Say, yes, it has, but here are the odds of you getting a bad side effect, myocarditis, whatever, from COVID, and the inflammation of the heart, and here's the risk of getting inflammation of the heart from the vaccine. And we know that the risk is much greater with COVID.
I guess the specific additional factor that Molly is throwing in is a factor to a lot of people, which is they're so anti-government, and there are people who simply believe, with lots of evidence, particularly if you're not a white person, that the government will do things to you medically that are bad for you. And I know it's not your job to focus on anti-government sentiment, but that is part of what's behind vaccine resistance, right?
Yeah, it's a push also against being told what to do in general.
Yeah.
And as you heard in the vaccine piece, it's not such a bad idea to push back and say why, you should get some good answers. But yeah, I mean, we know that this, from Tuskegee to you name it, there's a million reasons why people don't trust the government. I've learned a ton about that in recent years. I've done many pieces on an increased maternal mortality in people women of color, on and on and on. I actually was on a panel about that in Aspen Ideas Health. So, yeah, I mean, what is it? Trust and verify. Why should people trust? So you should do your homework and have an idea where they're coming from. There's so much wonderful stuff that's been written about the history of this, and if you come into one of those discussions without knowing about that history, I think that's a real mistake.
I think we should take one more question and then let John move on and let all of you move on with your day. Does anybody have one more question? Yeah, go ahead. Do it, microphone.
Thank you, Doctor, for being here today. My name is Gabrielle. I'm a student journalist at NYU. And I had a question kind of regarding the health equity aspect. And I know you are a strong supporter of centralizing empathy in healthcare. And how do you balance as a journalist continually being emotionally engaged without being burned out when you're covering such big pieces on health equity? How do you process that while still being able to do your job?
A great question to end on. Thank you.
It's a perfect question to end on, and because it goes right to what I tell the medical students. So as Steve said, I was at Columbia 37 years. Every 37 years, like clockwork, I switch institutions. So 11 years ago, I went over to NYU to start the Empathy Project. We make Hollywood quality short films to teach clinicians in training to be more empathetic and sensitive and competent, and to empower patients to demand that. And when I'm talking to the medical students, I talk about the wall that's always there between you and the patient. And it's the same thing in journalism when and it can be brutal in journalism. We have the mass shootings, and I mean, there's tons of PTSD in journalists from it, and in others, of course. But I talk about that wall between yourself and the patient, and you're always sculpting it. And if you make it too thick and too thick, you're going to miss out on the good stuff. If you make it too thin and porous, you're going to get emotionally nailed. So you're constantly sculpting it. And I tell them, look, it's a work in progress. I would encourage you to err on the side of making it too thin and too porous, because you really don't want to miss out on the good stuff. It's a whole other discussion in medicine about when you show emotions and when, and about empathy, when you can burn out, how empathy actually can help increase wellness among doctors. Whole other subject. But I think that is a huge challenge. And I think what's happening more in recent years, and certainly since I've been at CBS for the past 18 years, there's an increasing realization among the powers that be that you can't just keep sending people into the field to shooting after shooting after shooting. Same thing with the editors. Remember that the editors are seeing footage that's too graphic to get on the air. And I've spoken to editors. I mean, I have a whole role at CBS that's sort of not in my contract, where a lot of people talk to me, and then I sort of try to increase communication and do a lot of things offline, and they know that, I can keep their secrets and confidences. But I think a lot of people have talked to me about being upset in these situations, and I've talked to the powers that be, and there's been help now. There's official channels that people can go through, and people have rearranged editing schedules so that people can have some more time out. Don't just make it so you just come up with the next person, and it turns out coincidentally you've now had 4 mass shootings in a row. So I think just number one is understanding it's a big issue. It's a great question to finish up on. I think you're right, because we're human beings. How long ago was it that port to pay piece where that poor baby died, and I still could barely get through it?
Thank you, John. I knew this would be great. It actually turned out to be really great, which is significantly better than great. So let's thank John.
Thank you, everybody.
And thanks, everybody, for being here. I think our next event that I know for sure is October 29th, where we're doing an event on immigration reporting. So we'll tell you more about that as we get closer. So thanks again.